It was supposed to be just another talk show. Live from Washington, the set of Global Affairs now glowed under studio lights. The topic? International security. A routine segment. Nothing controversial. At least, that was the plan. Karoline Leavitt, a rising star in the Republican Party and a proud America First voice, sat tall in her seat, crisp blazer, an American flag behind her like a badge of honor. She smiled for the cameras, knowing her soundbite was coming. Across the screen, joining remotely from Burkina Faso, sat Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Calm. Steady. Wearing olive fatigues and no expression. No flag behind him, no theatrics. Just presence. The anchor wasted no time. Congresswoman Leavitt, how do you respond to growing claims that the U.S. presence in Africa breeds dependency? Karoline didn't hesitate. Let's be real, she said, leaning in. Without the United States, Africa wouldn't have the means to fight terrorism, build infrastructure, or even secure its borders. We've saved lives. We've built schools. We've fought extremists. Honestly, President Traoré should be thanking us. She smiled, satisfied. She was used to applause. But Traoré didn't clap. He didn't nod. He simply asked, "Thank you, for what? For the military bases we never requested? For aid tied to your politics? For drone strikes in villages you can't even pronounce?" The anchor froze. The room held its breath. Leavitt blinked, caught off guard. "We're offering you stability," she replied, voice clipped. Traoré's voice didn't rise. "But what you call stability feels more like a leash." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy. She tried to push through. "Do you honestly believe Africa can protect itself without American intelligence and military strength?" "Yes," he said plainly. "Because your presence doesn't protect us. It paints a target on our backs." He leaned slightly forward, not much, just enough. "Tell me, Congresswoman, how many wars has Africa brought to American soil?" She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. "How many African drones have circled your skies? How many sanctions have we imposed on your elections?" Still nothing. "If your definition of peace requires our silence, maybe we're better off without it." In the control room, a producer muttered, "This wasn't supposed to go viral." Too late. By the time the segment ended, Traoré's words were echoing across the internet in 5 languages. On TikTok, teenagers stitched his quote, "You're offering a leash and calling it a shield." On X, journalists posted it with one word, "Finally." Telegram channels in Nairobi and Johannesburg reposted it with fire emojis. In Washington, Leavitt's aides looked around nervously. Her camp rushed to reframe it. "Strong American leadership is often misinterpreted by anti-Western forces," a spokesperson told Fox News. But the damage was done, not by aggression, but by clarity. In Kenya, a professor tweeted, "Karoline's mistake wasn't arrogance. It was thinking Africa had forgotten how to speak." In Nigeria, a radio host played the moment on loop. "Tell me, how many wars has Africa brought to your soil?" The silence that followed spoke louder than any argument. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré's cabinet urged caution. "You've made your point," one minister said. "Let's not escalate." "I'm not escalating," he replied. She threw the first punch. "I just didn't flinch." In America, Leavitt booked a follow-up interview, this time on a network friendly to her narrative. "He's deflecting," she insisted. "Africa is unstable, and the U.S. has been the greatest force for peace and development there." But the show's fact-checker interrupted, "Respectfully, Congresswoman, U.S.-backed drone strikes have killed dozens of civilians in Africa over the last 10 years. She blinked. "That's classified military context." But the audience had heard enough. In Mali, graffiti appeared overnight, "We don't need bullets to speak." In Accra, students planned a panel titled, "Security or Subjugation." And in Ouagadougou, Captain Traoré stepped up to a podium. Short speech. Calm tone. "We have no quarrel with the American people," he said. "But when your leaders speak, we will not stay silent." The next morning, Leavitt's phone lit up. A message from her media advisor blinked on screen, "You tried to speak for Africa. Africa just spoke back. Karoline Leavitt was used to control. Capitol Hill. Fundraisers. Town halls. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her power was baked into the system. But suddenly, someone outside that system had said no, and he hadn't said it angrily. He said it clearly, calmly, and that terrified her more than any armed threat. He's just pandering to anti-American radicals, she told her communications team. But one young intern hesitated. With all due respect, Congresswoman, he didn't sound radical. He sounded grounded. Karoline turned, eyes sharp. You think that was grounded? The room went quiet. Meanwhile, in Africa, something real was shifting. Captain Traoré hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't insulted the U.S. He hadn't stormed off. He'd simply refused her premise. And people felt it. In Somalia, a columnist put it like this: he didn't just reject her message, he rejected her permission to deliver it. In Cameroon, youth activists launched a campaign with a simple slogan, "Our land, our terms." And in a private fundraiser in Dallas, Leavitt tried to regain footing. Africa has potential, she said, but we can't let hostile voices control the narrative. Someone from the crowd asked, is independence hostile? She stumbled. I mean, anti-American voices. Ones that... But the moment was gone. Again. Viral, not because of what she said, but because she couldn't say why a self-confident Africa made her so uneasy. Back in Ouagadougou, under the shade of a mango tree, Traoré met with students. Are you worried about backlash? One asked. He gave a quiet smile. There's no backlash when you were never leaning on them in the first place. But she's powerful, another said. So is a storm, he replied. But I've never seen a storm move the mountain. That day, his words traveled farther than any press release ever could. Africa wasn't yelling. It was answering. Not with rage, but with certainty. And that made the ground shift. Leavitt tried a new approach, a glossy video titled, Why Africa Still Needs Us. Slow-motion footage, U.S. Troops handing out food. American teachers in clinics. Smiling children holding English textbooks stamped donated by USAID. Her voiceover was smooth. For decades, America has stood with Africa, through war, disease, development. Without us, chaos fills the vacuum. The video played well, in some circles. But across Africa, people watched, then watched again. And by the third or fourth viewing, the question started. In Burkina Faso, a government official muttered under his breath, they keep filming themselves helping, but never ask who we were before they arrived. In Nigeria, a political analyst broke it down on live TV. Karoline Leavitt isn't offering partnership. She's offering permission. America builds, but only if you nod along. Refuse, and you're unstable. Asked to respond, Traoré didn't release a counter video. He held a short press conference. No drama. No fireworks. Just this, Africa has never been a blank page, he said. But they treat us like one. As if nothing mattered until they arrived with pen and ink. He looked out at the reporters. We don't need permission to exist with dignity. That was it. Back in Washington, pressure was building. Even conservative outlets started asking hard questions. Is U.S. aid really aid, or is it influence dressed up with a smile? Leavitt tried to stand her ground. I will never apologize for American values, she declared on a podcast. The host pressed gently, but should people have to accept your values just to receive your help? She paused. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because any answer she gave felt like it proved Traoré right. In Bamako, a protester held a cardboard sign, aid with conditions is just colonization with better PR. In Dar es Salaam, a mural appeared overnight. Traoré, tall, steady, next to the words, we didn't ask for your light. We're not in the dark. Then came the Atlantic Policy Forum, a chandelier-lit hall in Washington where diplomats and think tank leaders nodded through speeches designed to say a lot without saying much. Leavitt took the stage, composed. Let's be clear, she said. America's engagement in Africa has always been rooted in peace, freedom, and mutual respect. Polite applause. She went on. If we pull back, bad actors will fill the vacuum. China, Russia, extremists. That's not a theory. That's a fact. The room clapped again, less enthusiastically. In the hallway, a quiet ripple. She's saying the right things, but they're starting to sound hollow. And across the Atlantic? Traoré stood under a wide sky, no podium, no teleprompter. Just a circle of students, farmers, village elders. His stage was dust. His backdrop was truth. No script. Just clarity. Because Africa, at long last, wasn't waiting for a microphone. It had found its voice, and the world was finally listening. The sun had just begun to rise behind him, warm light catching his shoulders as Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before a quiet crowd. No script. Just the moment. They say if America leaves, he said, we will collapse. He paused. Then let them leave. And let's prove we won't. The crowd didn't cheer because they were told to. They erupted because, for the first time, someone had dared to say it out loud. Thousands of miles away, in a newsroom in New York, a sharp op-ed hit the morning front pages. The Leavitt Doctrine, Stability at the Price of Silence. It read, when a foreign power labels you unstable for disagreeing with them, that's not friendship. That's conditional loyalty disguised as partnership. The piece caught fire, shared across time zones, across languages. Karoline Leavitt's team huddled. The headlines weren't dying down. Should we offer him a debate? Moderate the conversation? She shook her head. No. We don't negotiate with people who reject American leadership. But by now, it wasn't just leaders rejecting it. It was mothers in refugee camps, whispering to field nurses, I used to fear if America pulled out. Now, maybe that's when we begin. Then came the flashpoint no one saw coming. A leaked email from Leavitt's own office, never meant for public eyes, hit the press. An internal memo outlined a strategy to paint rising African dissent as foreign disinformation, allegedly backed by rival powers. The tone was sterile. Strategic. When figures like Traoré gain traction, link their messages to anti-Western influence campaigns. Avoid direct confrontation. Use think tanks to plant doubts about their legitimacy. Within hours, the backlash was everywhere. Burkina Faso's official government account posted a single line, if truth becomes threat, perhaps the threat isn't ours. It struck a nerve. Across Africa, the memo wasn't just seen as political interference. It was seen as fear of a continent speaking for itself. Leavitt scrambled to clean up the damage. She went on morning television, smiling tightly. That memo doesn't reflect my personal beliefs. The host didn't let it slide. It came from your chief of staff. That doesn't mean I agree with every word. You approved the strategy. Another pause. Another clip gone viral. Not for what she said, but for what she couldn't explain. Meanwhile, Traoré said nothing. No press conference. No angry response. He just kept working, funding local development hubs, backing regional security teams from within Africa. No Western arms deals. No camera crews. A journalist asked if he planned to respond to the leaked memo. Traoré replied softly, some words defeat themselves. In Tanzania, a student ended her speech with a mic drop line that lit up social feeds, the leash is off, and they're scared of how far we'll run. In Ghana, someone spray-painted on a campus wall, she said, we needed them. We answered. Leavitt's own team was growing restless. Don't walk back the memo, one strategist advised. Just soften the tone. Say you're listening. You don't have to say you were wrong. But Karoline stood firm. I will not apologize for defending my country. Yet the ground kept shifting. Not because of what she said, but because of what Traoré didn't. No retaliation. No soundbite war. Just silence, and that silence kept growing louder. In Kenya, a columnist wrote, the West thinks silence means surrender. But in Africa, silence can mean judgment. And sometimes, it's a sentence. In Somalia, youth groups launched a grassroots movement called Number, We Answered. Thousands posted selfie videos with one message, they said we'd be lost without them. Look, we're still here. In one classroom, a young woman held up a globe and whispered to the camera, this is ours too. A French reporter finally asked Traoré, "Would you ever sit down with Congresswoman Leavitt?" His answer was quiet, measured. "She speaks of stability, but she builds it on control. We speak of sovereignty, and we build it on trust. There's nothing to negotiate between those two." Back in Washington, Leavitt went on offense again. "I will never be intimidated by foreign leaders who reject American values." But even her allies were shifting uncomfortably. One senator, speaking off the record, said, "She's turning a foreign policy debate into a personal crusade. That's not diplomacy. That's ego." And still, Traoré said nothing. He didn't need to. Because in the streets of Bamako, in the classrooms of Kigali, in the songs of Dakar, Africa was doing the speaking. In murals, in music, and in silence. The kind that doesn't ask for permission. The kind that doesn't wait for applause. The kind that changes history anyway. The silence didn't beg for attention. It didn't ask politely to be noticed. It demanded recognition. Karoline Leavitt faced the press again, this time flanked by 2 retired U.S. generals and a former ambassador to Nigeria. The backdrop, flags, polished wood, seriousness. She stepped up with practiced authority. "Africa's future matters deeply to us," she began. "But we can't sacrifice security. Without American leadership, chaos follows." She paused, expecting the usual nods. Instead, she got questions. "Whose security?" one journalist asked. "Theirs or ours?" Another chimed in, "Is leadership something you offer, or something you impose?" For the first time, Karoline didn't have a clean comeback. Her voice didn't tremble, but it didn't command the room either. Thousands of miles away, in Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré arrived at a regional summit with no motorcade, no media swarm, no prepared remarks. The agenda. African-led defense coalitions, interregional trade agreements, joint tech ventures, none of it filtered through Washington. When a reporter asked about Leavitt's latest comments, he gave a small shrug. "I heard them." "Will you respond?" "I already did," he said. "You just weren't listening the first time." One headline read, "Africa writes its own future, no facts to Washington required." In Addis Ababa, an Ethiopian MP made it even clearer, this isn't anti-American. It's post-American. In a small cafe in Cotonou, a group of young filmmakers got together. They took Karoline Leavitt's old speeches and cut them against footage of colonized Africa, then against scenes of new skylines rising from African cities. At the bottom of the screen, the words, "We've been building. You just never looked." Back in D.C., a private recording leaked, a whispered remark from one of Leavitt's aides, "This isn't about Traoré anymore. It's about the fact he never needed our stage to be heard." And in the hills outside Bobo Dioulasso, a boy practicing his French recited a line for his teacher. She spoke. He answered. We listened. The teacher smiled. "Now say it again, but say it like it's yours." In Brussels, a private NATO dinner hummed with talk of Africa. Diplomats passed sea base and sipped red wine while nervously circling the topic. "They're not just rejecting aid," a French official said. "They're starting to reject us." Karoline Leavitt swirled her glass. "Then maybe it's time we remind them who makes the rules." Even her allies paused. The room grew tight with discomfort. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, Traoré stood in a university lecture hall. No lights. No cameras. No guards. Just students. Just questions. When power demands gratitude, he told them, it isn't offering help, it's asserting hierarchy. He let the words hang in the air. True partnership doesn't knock with a clenched fist. Across the continent, something quiet but firm was growing. Students, journalists, community leaders. They weren't just rejecting Western policy, they were rejecting Western framing. They no longer wanted to reach development milestones written in someone else's language. They wanted to define success in their own. In Mozambique, a podcast host asked, if America's role is so essential, why do they panic when we imagine a world without them? Karoline Leavitt's approval abroad was in freefall. But inside far-right circles back home, she became something else, a symbol of defiance, not diplomacy. This isn't about Africa anymore, she said on a conservative radio show. It's about not letting anti-Americanism grow unchecked. But that framing collapsed the moment a journalist from Burkina Faso asked, "Is it anti-American to want to stand on your own?" She had no answer, because everything she believed in rested on the idea that being needed meant being right. Traoré never shouted. He didn't stage walkouts. He didn't stage anything. He just quietly withdrew, from summits, from frameworks, from structures he no longer believed in. And somehow, that withdrawal spoke louder than any confrontation. Because power isn't always taken. Sometimes, it simply returned. The Global Partnership Forum opened in Geneva. Flags lined the stage. Polite smiles filled the room. Karoline Leavitt took the podium again, the keynote speaker. "In uncertain times," she declared, "one thing remains constant: American leadership. Where we go, freedom follows." Applause followed. But it was thin. Scattered. Because something had changed. And across the ocean, far from marble floors and catered banquets, in a dusty city square where no teleprompters blinked, someone held up a cardboard sign, written in faded ink, "We didn't need permission. We just needed to be heard." There was no fanfare. No red carpet. Just a man with a microphone and the morning sun rising behind him. "They say if America leaves, we'll fall apart," he said, voice steady. "Then let them leave. And let us rise without them." The crowd didn't cheer because they were told to. They erupted because someone had finally dared to say what they'd all been thinking. Half a world away, an op-ed landed like thunder, the Leavitt Doctrine, stability at the price of silence. It asked a simple question: if a foreign power calls you unstable unless you obey, was that ever friendship to begin with? The words traveled fast, from newsroom chats in D.C. to cafes in Dakar. On the ground, something began to shift. In a refugee camp in Burkina Faso, a mother whispered to a nurse, "I used to fear the day America would leave. Now, maybe that's when we begin." But the real spark wasn't a speech. It was a leak. An internal memo from Karoline Leavitt's office, never meant to be public, outlined a quiet strategy: reframe African independence as foreign manipulation. Link rising leaders to misinformation campaigns. Don't confront, discredit. When it hit the press, Africa didn't blink. It roared. Burkina Faso's government posted just one sentence: "If truth becomes threat, perhaps the threat isn't ours." Suddenly, the memo wasn't just a document, it was a mirror. A mirror reflecting something deeper, the fear of losing control over a continent that had started to speak for itself. Leavitt tried to contain the damage. She went on morning shows, her smile stretched thin. "The memo doesn't reflect my personal views." But the host didn't flinch. "It came from your chief of staff. I don't endorse every phrase. You endorsed the mindset." That clip. Viral. Everywhere. And while the world dissected her words, Ibrahim Traoré stayed quiet. No press blasts. No press tours. Just results. He was busy funding security coalitions, African ones. Building development hubs, African-led. The work spoke louder than the noise. When asked about the memo, he shrugged, "Words that defeat themselves don't need an answer." In Tanzania, a student ended her speech with fire, "The leash is off. And now they're scared of how far we'll run." In Accra, someone spray-painted across a wall. She said we needed them. We answered. And then came the pressure. Leavitt's advisors begged her to soften. Frame the leak as a misstep. Show some humility. She refused. "I won't apologize for defending my country." But it wasn't about her country anymore. It was about a posture, one that assumed being needed was the same as being right. Traoré didn't fight back. He simply stepped back. From forums. From old deals. From negotiations written in someone else's voice. And that silence. It didn't fade. It thundered. A Kenyan journalist captured it best. "The West thinks silence is surrender. But in Africa, silence can be judgment. And sometimes, it's a sentence." Soon, young people launched a campaign called #WeAnswered. A girl in a classroom held up a globe and said, "They said we'd be lost without them. But look, we're still right here." At a summit, a French reporter asked Traoré if he'd sit down with Congresswoman Leavitt. He said calmly, "She speaks of stability built on control. We speak of sovereignty built on trust. There's nothing to negotiate between those two." In Washington, Leavitt doubled down. "I will not be intimidated by foreign leaders who reject American values." Even her allies winced. One senator whispered off the record, "She's turning a conversation into a crusade." But Traoré said nothing. He didn't have to. Across the continent, people spoke for him. In music. In speeches. In silence. In Geneva, Karoline Leavitt took the stage at the Global Partnership Forum. "Where we go," she declared, "freedom follows." The applause was polite, but scattered. Because across the ocean, in a field under the open sky, Ibrahim Traoré stood before thousands. No notes. No script. Just him and his people. "They say freedom follows them," he said. "But freedom isn't a parade. It's a fire. And we light it ourselves." And they roared, not as a crowd, but as a people. Back in Geneva, a reporter asked Leavitt, "How do you respond to African leaders rejecting U.S. aid?" She replied, "Aid is not control. It's compassion." Outside the hall, a protester held up a cardboard sign, "You can't give what you won't let go of." Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré released a quiet statement, "Africa isn't rising because it's funded. It's rising because it's done being told what it is." And then he said nothing more. No victory lap. No last word. Because the message had landed. Leavitt came to represent a mindset. One that believed if you weren't in charge, the world might fall apart. What she hadn't realized was that the world was already standing. In a classroom in Burkina Faso, a teacher wrote on the chalkboard, "They said we needed them." A student raised their hand. "Is that a quote?" The teacher smiled. "No. That's history."